Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Neil Patterson, the forgotten voices. Have child grooming gang survivors been ignored? Stay where you are. Hi everyone, just a heads up that we are going to be discussing child abuse and grooming on the podcast, so just be aware of that. Clearly, we are in the midst of an almighty row right now. Politics dominated by calls for a public inquiry into the predominantly Asian gangs that groomed and abused children in towns across the UK. We have heard loads from Elon Musk, not so much from the survivors of the abuse. So I've got Sky's home editor and a representative of the Survivors Trust standing by. We'll be speaking to them in just a second. But just to remind you, this, well, let's call it a debate, began when GB News saw letters from the Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips. She denied repeated requests from Oldham Council for a public inquiry into the abuse that happened there. A number of men, the majority of British Pakistani origin, were eventually convicted of crimes committed in the early 2010s, including rape, trafficking girls for sex, and conspiracy to engage in sexual activity with a child. The true number of victims may never be known. Now, of course, this was then seized upon by figures including Elon Musk, as was the accusation that social workers missed or ignored abuse for fear of being called racist. But of course, there has already been a public inquiry, Professor Alexis Jay reporting 2 years ago, yet none of her 20 recommendations have been acted upon. The Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips, has been speaking to our political editor, Beth Rigby, on the Electoral Dysfunction podcast.
Nothing is off the table. Nothing is off the table. And if the victims come forward to me in this victims panel that I will make, and they say, actually, we think there needs to be a national inquiry into this or a linking up of that, I'm going to, I'll listen to them. But I'm not going to. I refuse to allow years and years of experience in safeguarding, basing what I know on evidence. I refuse to make government decisions on the basis of a row.
Well, as mentioned, our home editor, Jason Farrell, is here. Also, Lucy Duckworth from the Survivors Trust, herself a survivor of child abuse. Thanks both for being with us. And look, I should say at this point, we're recording this early afternoon on Wednesday, so I'm keeping one eye on the House of Commons at the moment as the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill is going through there today. The Conservatives have tried to apply an amendment which would call for a public inquiry. But Lucy, to you first. The past few days have been characterised mostly by some pretty ungratifying point scoring taking place between, billionaires and politicians. I'm just wondering what the past few days have been like for survivors of child abuse.
I think they've been really mixed. I think they've been actually quite traumatic, seeing so many lies and misinformation in the public domain is incredibly traumatising for survivors who have been silenced so long and often have the experience of not being believed. But that also comes with finally we're being heard. People have been saying to me, this is a crisis. This isn't a crisis. The numbers haven't suddenly jumped. We knew 2 years ago that 500,000 children are being sexually abused in this country every year. We know that there's 13 million adult survivors living with the trauma, struggling to get access to the support they need in this country. We know that, Jess Phillips knows that, the government know that, and the previous government know that. So it's really good to finally get the press it deserves, but with this will always, there'll be people listening to this right now, people who haven't disclosed, people who want to and didn't get the support they needed, and hopefully people who have had a better pathway. But we mustn't ever underestimate the impact it has every time we speak about this. And therefore, we only speak about it because we have to and because we want action.
Lucy, you know about the extent of the abuse. Other survivors will know about the extent of it. But do you think that the general public do? The reason I ask, do you think Elon Musk has done something of a public service in thrusting this conversation into the national spotlight?
I think it comes as disappointment for all of us that it's taken somebody outside of the country who doesn't understand anything of the complexities of what we're dealing with to get this to the prominence it deserves. No, I don't think the public understand it, and that's not to offend anyone at all. It's been discovered that, and that was one of the recommendations of ICSA was that there is a public awareness campaign.
I mean, just for those who don't know, ICSA is the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which of course you are involved with.
It is indeed, and it ran from 2014 to 2022. It published a really big report on the same day that Liz Truss resigned, so already it didn't get the press it deserved then, and so survivors are hurting from that. There is no point in changing the law if we're not educating people and taking them with us at the same time. So yes, this is helpful, this sort of exposure is helpful, but it's only helpful if it's well informed and if debate can be had.
Jason, just pick up the reins here for us, if you will. It's been mentioned at Prime Minister's Questions today. It's been mentioned many times before, frankly, by people like Lucy. We have had 2 years since the publication of Alexis Jay's recommendations, and pretty much nothing has been done.
I was sat with Alexis Jay, just about to interview her about her report on the moment that Liz Truss resigned. And it was 8 years of very hard work, basically overshadowed by a 6-week administration coming to an end. But the point about that is, of course, there was a lot of political upheaval. The recommendations didn't get the publicity that they deserved, and they also seem to not have the political capital to go with them. And I think it has actually, added some impetus that now we're talking about it, that suddenly.
This also speaks to the broader point about the voices of those who have survived child sexual abuse not being listened to and not acted upon. After all those years of investigation and work by Alexis Jay and others, that nothing was done in the immediate aftermath. I mean, to what do you attribute that? You
need to have the political will and you need to have public support. I think it's fair to say we didn't have either at that time. Jason, you recalling that story, I remember it well. I remember it actually gave me goosebumps, you just saying that. And that's just the impact of that day. We were all in this room waiting, as Jason says, and then it was pulled. And the metaphor that is for survivors who don't get believed or whose cases get delayed, whose cases get pulled at the last minute. We hear it time and time again. It's huge. And this issue isn't in one town. It isn't in one organised gang. There's organised networks everywhere. And what the issue we've got is our systems, our laws. The last major overhaul in child protection was in 1989, before the internet even existed. Our systems and our laws haven't evolved to absorb the emerging threats of child protection in the way that they should have done. And that's why we need a change in law. The inquiry was important because it looked at patterns and trends. It obviously couldn't look at every single area of where there is child sexual abuse or child sexual exploitation, because it would never have finished if it did that. I'm speaking as a church survivor. The town I was abused in wasn't looked at. However, I'm fully supportive of the fact that if the recommendations were implemented, it would have an impact across the whole nation. The only way we can start to tackle this is to start. Those recommendations, they got criticism for not going far enough. There were 20 of them. For my 8 years at the inquiry, I would never have dreamt that I would be sat here 2 years later saying, can we just have one of them?
Jason, you yourself have been covering these sorts of stories for a long time. You've spoken to victims of abuse yourself. This whole narrative around another inquiry being pushed by Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage, and of course Elon Musk, are those that you speak to of a similar mind? Is there a demand for a public inquiry, a wide-ranging, broader ranging than Alexis Jay's inquiry of the type that those politicians are asking for?
I was listening in on an X-Space gathering last night with some victims talking about this, and I was with Marlon West, who's the father of a victim. Marlon, for example, very keen. He thinks it will lead to greater accountability, that it will have a broader brush. He comes from an area that's not a big town. It's close to Manchester, and it's happened in his area, and that area hasn't been looked at. There is the advantage of the local inquiry in that it can get into the nitty-gritty of that particular area. But then there are others, and Sammy Woodhouse, for example, who a prominent campaigner from Rotherham, saying, I actually quote what she said it could take many, many years And have we really got that time? And I think that is the concern. Obviously, the inquiry took 8 years to pull all this together. Is it going to slow things down? Do we already know enough? I think one of the other key things is we don't have the data right now to know enough about it. The data collection is really bad. Actually, the inquiry that people don't talk about is Sajid Javid's one. He ordered an inquiry, I think it was in 2018, saying there would be no stone unturned. We need to look at the ethnicity of the people involved in this. That inquiry came back. The headline was that people involved in group-based sexual abuse were mostly white. However, it did say there was a paucity of data and that the data collection was poor. And there's a lot of references to not really being able to get to the bottom of this because of the lack of data.
Jason, I completely agree. And I guess one of the questions is what would be the purpose of an inquiry? And I think people are asking for it because they're angry, because they haven't had accountability so far and they haven't had justice. That's because nothing's happened for the first inquiry. We're 2 years later and nothing's happened. And I think we really need to understand that people don't abuse because of their ethnicity or because of the job they're in. It's the other way around. People commit child sexual abuse or child sexual exploitation because they are in a position of trust. They want to do that so they get themselves into a position of trust. Look, I've done a lot of work in the Church of England and people have always said to me, how come there's so many priests that abuse children? It's the other way around. They wanted to abuse children, so they joined the church because that automatically gave them a cloak of invisibility, a position of trust. And then you've got the institutional protection as well, which we often see in institutions around the country, boarding schools, state schools, everywhere. So when we're talking about organised networks, it's not about the demographic of the perpetrator. Organised networks are everywhere. Organised networks of abuse are operating in the Church of England, in the Catholic Church, in schools. We need to get the laws in place, such as mandatory reporting, such as a single core set of data, which you alluded to there as well, which was another one of the recommendations, so we can better understand this.
But that anger, Lucy, that you were talking about, that has been felt by survivors at the inaction, there is a huge amount of public anger at the moment as more and more detail of the offending becomes known. Do you understand that anger, that frustration on the part of the general public?
Well, it's always been easier for us to view it in the abstract, isn't it? And, you know, we often, when we talk about it in the media, we'll say the perpetrator's a monster and we kind of fictionalise them. And they're not actually our brother or our uncle or the bloke who lives next door. Yeah. And we talk about the victims as, where were they? They were part of grooming gangs, or they were in the church, or they were children. Doesn't matter where they were. Where they were doesn't excuse what happened to them. This might come across as really wrong, but we've been really confused as to why the public haven't been this angry before. I'm not surprised by it. They should be absolutely outraged. We should be demanding action that 6 children in every primary school class are at risk of experiencing sexual violence. This is 2025. This is completely unacceptable. So we've got survivors everywhere saying, what about us? When the riots happened and very quickly prosecutions for those people who were looting and causing violence were brought into place, I had survivors write to me and say, why is my life less important than a shop window? So we've never really got a grasp on this. ICSA heard the testimony of 7,500 survivors. They've been listened to. The recommendations are there. They are committing to continuing to work with survivors. We just need to honour those testimonies that were given to us. I
mean, controversial, you could say that Elon Musk gave people a target to be angry at. Who are you supposed to be angry with when we've got this sort of wide-scale child abuse in all these different institutions, in all sorts of different settings? It's quite hard. And then Elon Musk comes and blames it on the wrong people. Jess Phillips says every person that I've spoken to who's been in the situation, whether they agree with her politics or not, have generally said she's sympathetic. She's a campaigner for women. She's the MP who stands up and reads out the names of the women murdered every year by men in Parliament. It is incredible, isn't it, that a tweet from Elon Musk has led to newsrooms news meetings talking about this, Parliament talking about this, laws being pushed through. And that in itself is extraordinary, is a phenomenon that we should be wary of. But nonetheless, this is an issue that has been overlooked in the sense that we had this massive inquiry for 8 years. We haven't introduced any of the recommendations as a consequence of it. And, I've been going around the country for the last however many years, meeting women who've been victims of different kinds of sexual abuse and sexual assault, and they are often not taken seriously by the police. Sometimes, and still recently as actually last month, there was a woman who got a subject access request and finally got an apology from the police only last month about the fact that they had said that she was making lifestyle choices, that the strangulation that happened to her might have been conceived as something she might have enjoyed, that she was not seen as a credible witness, and therefore they didn't feel that she had much chance of a prosecution. And when you read through some of the comments that were made by the police in that case, it just said to me that attitudes haven't moved on as far as they should have done, considering the number of inquiries that we've had.
What do we understand about what the next steps this government will take will be?
We'll have to see, because we've just heard Jess Phillips has said that she's setting up this victims panel. I know of some people who've been told about being on this victims panel. I think it has been in the offing for quite a while. Again, it was one of those things that seemed to go on hold. Was it going to happen? Wasn't it going to happen? That is going to happen. She's going to have a listen to them and decide whether they think there should be a national inquiry. So I guess that is one of the first questions that will be answered. And then I think the government will continue to try to push forward the bills and the recommendations that they're pushing forward anyway, whether or not that national inquiry happens or not.
Lucy, I mean, has any of what has happened over the past few days, has any of that been helpful to those who are in the position that they probably still need support, that they themselves are survivors of child abuse?
It's still too early to say. Obviously, we've had a massive increase in people contacting us, which is always helpful because we can provide the right support. I can say that obviously this is against the backdrop of a funding crisis in the sector. We've got consistently proven research that the best treatment for anyone suffering the trauma of any form of sexual violence, whether they're boys, men, women, girls, is talking therapies and counselling, and that is increasingly becoming difficult to access, and very often it falls to our sector to provide it. I really hope, and my appeal to anyone who has been affected by this is to just know that you're not alone, and it can feel a very lonely place, and it can feel a very desperate place to get your voice heard and to be sort of shouting into what can often feel like the darkness. Now we are being heard, but that too can feel quite overwhelming as well. So it has to be done really carefully, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Because
for a lot of people, they will not have had their voices heard at the times that those crimes were being committed upon them. And fast forward a few years, they now find themselves in the position of feeling that their voices is once again not being heard.
Yeah, and Neil, I hear you understandably talking a lot in the past tense there. Yeah. There is no evidence to be talking in the past tense. We know for a fact that children right now, while we've been having this debate, have experienced sexual violence. We know that men are going online and sharing that, and that's not being intercepted. The police do not have the training. That's not the fault of their own. We use victim-blaming language that puts people off coming forward. This isn't stuff that everyone's meant to instinctively know. They're not going to know it unless we have the conversations. We've not been allowed to have the conversations. We have to have those conversations. We have to get the training in place. We have to start changing the culture.
Jason, do you get the impression this is the point at which things actually change?
I think the key thing around having proper, decent collection of data, policing attitudes towards women who come forward with complaints. And maybe this will be a turning point. We've got a new government that say that they're committed to this. So I think, we'll see. It could be a good turning point for victims, but it's also been quite a divisive time. It is a difficult time for victims. It's a difficult time for community relations as well. And I think that's something that we should be alert to.
Jason Farrell, Lucy Duckworth, great to chat to you both. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now, if you're a survivor of rape or sexual abuse and violence, the Survivors Trust runs a free confidential national helpline 7 days a week for people aged 16 plus. You can find all the details in the notes attached to the podcast. That's your lot for today. We'll see you again tomorrow.